Today we have Oliver Goodenough, who's adjunct professor here, who's been kind enough to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship and innovation, and give you a little bit of background on him. Oliver is a pioneer in the study of implications of both neuroscience and digital revolution for law, technology, and society. He's currently a professor of law and director of the scholarship at Vermont Law School, a faculty fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where he is a co-director of the Law Lab project, researching how the digital world can support entrepreneurship. He is also a research fellow at the Reuter Institute of Law and Behavioral Research, and an adjunct professor, obviously, here at their school in the M.E.M program. His publications include Law, Mind, and Brain, co-edited by Michael Freeman, and Law and the Brain, co-edited by Samir Zeki. Professor Goodenough received his BA from Harvard University, so I think it's an AB, isn't it, at Harvard? Yeah. And his JD from the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also practiced law in New York City, as well as being an academic. Most importantly, his elective here in the M.E.M program, and I have all the data for this, is actually the most popular elective in the M.E.M program. So many of you who have been here over the recent years probably took this course. For those students who are here, this is a preview of what you can experience next fall when you come back. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Goodenough, for being here.
Thank you very much. I hope, as a preview, it does not impact negatively my status as a popular elective. I'm very grateful for this opportunity because it is a chance actually to try out some work that I'm in the middle of, and that is both a plus and a minus. You will get the excitement, hopefully, of discovery, and also the limitations of discovery as we go forward. But the talk, I'm living up to my challenge here. I am the chalk guy in the M.E.M department, and so I scribble semi-legible things on the blackboard, and my students, know that hopefully during the course of the talk they'll figure out what they mean and what they say. I've got 5 or 6 rather basic topics I'm going to cover today. A little bit of an introduction. I'm going to suggest a model for this entrepreneurial innovation process. It's at least a little more complex than some, and perhaps not complex enough. Talk about the different psychology, incentives, and support that come at the different stages in this entrepreneurial process, that it's not a unitary process, but rather one in which there are different elements of all those factors. I'm going to focus in a little bit on the handoffs, because I think the handoffs are an interesting piece in this model, the handoffs between the different places, and they provide a particular challenge for us as we figure out how to promote the process, and how to keep it fair, and keep people in the games, which is another very interesting piece of this. Talk a little bit about education, with some focus on the M.E.M. I think that the M.E.M. is actually a pretty good way of covering a lot of these problems and producing people who are capable across the spectrum, which is a good thing. And finally, talk a little bit about research and development, where some of the current research in this is headed, at least that I'm aware of, and also there may be some business opportunities. There are opportunities in this as we go forward, and I'd like to at least flag 2 or 3 of those that I think. I'm hoping that you'll give back as we go. There we are. I am a professor. I go into full professor mode fairly easily, which means that I will dominate the conversation. That's all right, it's how I'm supposed to, right? So, anyway, but I do hope that nonetheless that you folks will give back, because as I try this out, you are an audience who actually knows more about this probably than I do. My hope is that if I'm able to bring a little bit of intellectual order, you will bring a lot of detail and knowledge back as we go forward. Okay? Great. So, first of all, in the introduction, what is our problem? And the problem is an interesting one. I've been working now on in and around trying to figure out this world of entrepreneurship, how we support it, how we create it. I've been lucky enough to have some support from the Kaufman Foundation, as many of you are aware, the Foundation of Entrepreneurship. They are eager to figure out how to better make all of this happen. It improves human welfare. a bunch of things fall out that are good. If you think about the State of the Union speech, right, our great hope for the economy is entrepreneurship and innovation. These are the things, these are the mantras, this is what we're out to promote. A problem with that is that it's underdescribed. It's underdescribed. You get into this, there's all kinds of books out there, there's book after book after book, and they've all got pieces of it, and it just isn't as fully described as it could be at any rate. That's my hope, because as an academic, I'm hoping to better describe it, so actually it's an opportunity that I'm putting up there. I'm at least posing this as an opportunity for myself. Still underdescribed. Why is that the case? And I think that part of the reason for that is that it's not a unitary phenomenon. There are a series of things that must occur semi-in sequence, semi-simultaneously, which require different incentive structures, different psychologies, all of these things we're going to talk about here. And then indeed part of the challenge is keeping them separate enough to make each one work. Think a little bit about metabolism, right? The metabolism in cells, for instance, there's a different set of ways that things get burnt. There are different pieces of it that have to occur, and actually the byproducts of one and the ecosystem for one can inhibit the other. So we've got these mutually not fully consistent sets of tasks that need to go forward and happen. At least that's what I'm coming to. And my model that I've got at the moment talks about stages in this. Again, some of them are simultaneous, some of them are sequential, but at least 4 different stages that I like to divide it out into. And again, I'm not alone in some of this, but I'm hoping that I'm at least a little clearer about something. First of all, what I might call raw discovery. Just finding out new stuff. Figuring out new ways that quantum mechanics means that silicon can work to, the kinds of things that are just out there at the edge of science. And I call it science rather than engineering. There are folks in this department, right, or in this school who do this kind of thing. It's not that these are mutually exclusive, but it's useful to think of it in that kind of way. And one of the reasons is that the people who are interested in that are sometimes not the folks interested down the line here. Listening to their talk, right, they said they don't care what the idea is. They want to build it. The folks here care what the idea is passionately, and are just interested in that. Whoa, I'm out there on the idea. We get down here, and then we get to a second stage of inventing an application for human needs. And this is actually, I'm working on as one of the key steps in entrepreneurship as opposed to science, is that what is that application? And not only what is the application, but how does the application relate to things humans actually need in some fashion? Now, it need not be a direct human application in the sense that we can have things for the environment and all that, but these are things that people, as a group, will eventually pay for and want to see happen. And that's a different stage, and indeed the entrepreneurial inventiveness, I call this inventing, right? This is inventiveness. May be a little different from that raw discovery science kind of inquiry stuff. The invention is that moment when we see, yeah, there's that new knowledge floating around out there. Maybe it's even old knowledge. One of my favorites in this is the container, right? The shipping container, huge invention. Just it was a box. Somebody had to remember that if you built a box, it would work. And fabulous. It wasn't quantum mechanics. It was a box. But there was that invention where we could apply some piece of knowledge that's floating out there, typically new but not necessarily, as an invention for human needs. And this I kind of qualify as being both to some degree science, but this is where the talents of the engineer really come into play. The engineer is preoccupied with that, wanting to build it, wanting to make it happen. That's great. Next stage, bringing the application to operational fruition. It's not just envisioning it, inventing it, saying, if we did this, that would be cool, that would be great. But then saying, okay, roll up the sleeves, start working on nights and weekends, and build a thing that actually does what we envision. So there's the invention, then there's the getting it to operational fruition. And again, engineers at the fore, or some kind of engineering talent and that kind of thing, but we also start to see in that business, which is the ability to bring together disparate elements of finance, of marketing, of all these things, and begin to actually create what will eventually be, in the 4th stage, bringing the application to an economic and activity fruition. In other words, it's going to be that self-sustaining piece. It's going to be something that people will want to buy. It's going to be ways of getting that out into places that they will want to buy it, all of that kind of thing. And again, I've labeled that for convenience more the business end of this. Okay? So what we see then is if this makes sense, and it's not the only way to slice and dice. I'm sure there are other ways to slice and dice this thing, but we've got a set of stages in this, which are going to involve different people, different talents, different psychologies, and different incentive structures to make work properly. What's this about? Well, I'm thankful to a good friend of mine, Carl Bergstrom. Yeah.
Just before you get that, just if you can comment or your thoughts on the model and how you look at that, and because this is a very engineering and science one, which I think is probably relevant for the setting. But what are some of your thoughts around because there's actually a model that's almost inverted, which is kind of starting with the consumer need and then working your way backwards versus kind of solution looking for a problem. What are some of your thoughts around how this model relates or changes to different areas, especially around like non-science focused innovation and
you mean things like my container and that kind of stuff?
Like the container, like Facebook.
Although Facebook, actually, I'll challenge you a little bit on, because Facebook is at least in part brought about not by a set of discoveries around social interaction that actually are I think an important precursor to a bunch of this. That there's one way to think about these is precursors. In almost a chemical way. That you've got to have the precursor for my biology is going to run out here, but you have to have the precursors for higher kinds of organic chemistry to get there. You create the kind of raw blocks, and then the next thing, and the thing picks up the next one. And you're right that you can view it backwards, and indeed, if you're this person, you're going to be viewing it backwards, right? Or I shouldn't say backwards, the other way in the combination. But even things like Facebook, one of the things that I'll jump ahead a little bit here, one of the things that's available to folks like you, and that I understand Boston is actually maybe better at than the Valley, is the notion that the applications for into social contexts require actually an understanding of a far better science of sociality that you're tapping into, and indeed that's what I'm going to get to somewhat later on when I start to talk about mechanism and institutional design problems, because that mechanism and institutional design perspective is a key one for some of these kinds of things. Anyway, so great point.
Would you say then that something that we would consider a disruptive technology is, like Christensen's example in the disk drive business, was in a sense folding back on itself, that it started as the first disk drive, scientific engineering business, and then an entire new business was created by underpricing, i.e. working on the economics and folding back on what's been the scientific and engineering.
Good point. And actually, this is a very. I'm going to have to. This is exactly the kind of feedback I'm looking for, which is both of you are suggesting in a way. Don't think of this as just coming this way. Oliver, you live up here, so you look at it this way. Folks who live down here look at it that way, and indeed there is a recursive element to it, which is an
But at the same time, if you're in the middle, like some of my colleagues are, you're looking at it both ways.
Okay. You may well be looking at it both ways.
You can
Exactly.
start anywhere in there.
You can, and I think again they're feeding back on each other. But one of the key things to me, at any rate, is the fact that the things that make this work can be quite different than the things that make that work. And we've had a model recently in some of our work which says, oh, this has got this. The university's got to look much more like that, the business world. And at least one of the conclusions I'm coming to is maybe that's not the case. Maybe that's not the case. That yes, we want to maybe make better interactions. We want to make those handoffs better, but we don't necessarily want to undo one direction or the other on this thing. Why? Because coming back here is the fact that as I say, I want to give a little shout out to Carl Bergstrom. He's one of the world's most astonishing intellects and is a theoretical biologist at the University of Washington, where he specializes in immune systems, network properties, and all this kind of things. He's just basically reinvented, using network properties, the citation valuation system for science. He's just using a thing called eigenfactor and network effects. Anyway, great guy. But he, thinking about some of this, noted that the system of academia, the traditional system of academia, is very good for promoting information flows that are diffusive. Think about this for a moment. What are the incentive structures for academia? Incentive structures for academia, at least typically, are not financial. They're acclaim-based, right? They're acclaim-based. You get, you want to be paid decently, all that good stuff. But essentially, your status is prizes. Your status is publications. Your status is based on the notion of diffusion of knowledge. Now, you keep it in your lab for a while because you don't want people jumping on you. But once you've got it to a stage, your job is to let it go into the world. And as Carl pointed out to me, if you're talking about a system for the discovery and diffusion and the feedback around this piece, the sort of raw discovery piece, it works very well. It works very well. Because what we don't want to do is to bound it by certain kinds of proprietary-based secrecy. We do not necessarily want intellectual property in that circumstance. What we're eager for is to get things interchanged back and forth at a reasonably high velocity. So we have a set of structures where the incentives are for publishing, where the rewards are for diffusion, where all that is the case, and where the funding sources are unrelated. You know, there's this funny stuff of, students pay, and we, trade a few hours of our time a week, right, to teach you, okay, But what we really want to do is we want to go and we want to, return loose back on that problem, that idea that we're actually passionate about. And what we want to be able to do is spend our time doing that. We'll trade some of that out. We'll write government grants, and the government, luckily, takes wheelbarrows of money and occasionally, pours them on top of you. And the university keeps you going in the meantime. And all of that happens, and we're allowed to be in this kind of slightly cloud cuckoo land. Any of you, the Gulliver's Travel one that nobody ever reads, including myself, is that one about the thinkers, and they're just out there, thinking about stuff. Tenure, that much maligned tenure is a piece of this. Why? Because, actually it was a Dartmouth professor who told me that at a certain level of description, there is no difference between the most brilliant research and doing nothing. And how are you going to tell? You just, you give tenure to everybody and you hope. Anyway, there's one other thing it does, by the way, and this is my idea, is that it prevents senior academics from spending all their time trying to get each other fired in petty status contests. Okay? Because they can't do it, so they don't go. All right. Because it's all status. It's petty status. The parking lot disputes, right, in academia are huge. Why? I mean, it's another one of these status games. It's about status, and therefore we play status games, and tenure helps prevent that from getting out of control. All right, so we have that kind of set of psychologies up here. We've got it's an openness, it's status, it's discovery. Business down here, frequently, but not always, because there is an open source model that can work. There's an openness model that can work in that area. But down here, it's often about closedness, appropriation. Information has value because it's instrumental. We can do things with it, and those things can give us value. We can create value for society, and we can capture some of that value for ourselves. As said here, it'd be nice to do something that would save the world, but if I can, but A, that needs to make a little money, because otherwise it's unsustainable. One of my favorite quotes of the year is somebody who said that profit is nature's way of telling you you're useful. Okay, so that's all right. Okay, here you go. Profit can be in that context. So we've got, and to get that we often want to have closedness. We want to have our idea. We want to beat the market. We want to have even some IP protection, because the set of strategic challenges into this level are different. Indeed, how we get capital, how we get around, getting that sort of thing is going to be different. It's a different system. And at least hope for insight number one is that each of these phases, as we move more and more into that kind of does it make money in the marketplace validation, is we have a different set of incentives. And there are folks who are out there calling for bringing this kind of stuff to the university. And I'm sure the university can use some of it. But I also will push back and say, yeah, and then what you're going to get is something that isn't the university anymore and doesn't do its piece of the ecosystem. There are folks down here who say, oh, we should be, why all this emphasis on profit? And the answer is because it is that validation piece. And down here, that works pretty well. But we have a different different set of institutional needs at each of these levels. So that comes down here into institutions. One of the things that my students know is that I have this funny view that the law and other institutions, other human institutions, are in effect the kind of building blocks like girders and that kind of thing that we use to glue together social interaction. That in the same way that you can begin to think about structures, right? There's different and there are different ways of holding up things. You can have skyhooks and you can have things underneath and you can have trusses and all these different ways that as an engineer you can conceive of building a structure to carry something or support something across a void. Institutions like the law do the same thing for the challenges of sociality and the challenges of cooperative sociality, because those challenges are out there. I'm influenced heavily by game theory in this. There are folks who say game theory is passé. They're probably right, but I'm there. And I'm also influenced by a set of understandings called mechanism design. There's a guy in the computing department at Harvard, in particular, a guy named David Parks, whose thesis on mechanism design is well worth attention of anybody who wants to follow along with this. Because what he and the other folks doing this essentially argue is that we are not prisoners of the prisoner's dilemma, right? Most of you have seen the prisoner's dilemma. This is that problem that the incentive structures drive us to non-cooperation and to low-level solution spaces. And there's lots of places where that's the case. But one of the things that's interesting about humans is that they can recognize prisoners' dilemmas often and say, I'm not going there. That's quicksand. That's productive quicksand. And we have the tools also to bridge those. We have the tools like contract. Contract is a solution space for problems of first mover, for problems of all kinds of things. If you've got a structure within which you can make a mutually binding obligation, we can put a bridge. We can put a bridge across those chasms of defection, which are the problems of things like the prisoner's dilemma. Property system, particularly an intellectual property system, A, gives us the ability to invest against the world. Imperfect, but gives us that ability. And B, in the intellectual property thing, solves also the problem of first mover in a disclosure game. There's a disclosure game. You've got a great idea, you want me to be part of it, tell me. And you say, no, you have to commit, right? Well, I'm not going to commit. We've got this first mover problem, right, in this information game. And so what we end up with is if we can have an externalized property convention like patent, now I can disclose. In fact, I'm required to, but I'm protected from expropriation on disclosure. So again, the law is a system within which we can make these things. Business organizations, when you commit to each other in a business organization way, you're making, again, a set of enforceable commitments across institutions that are important. And indeed, one of the things I want to mention in that one is a key element that at least I think it's a key element that I'm working on, which is called outcome interdependence. Outcome interdependence. If we can create a set of bonds that make us interdependent with each other on outcomes, we will cooperate at a high level. Why? Because A, the benefit's out there, and that's the one that the economists typically look at. It's the mutual benefit, but also mutual failure. Mutual failure will spur us on, keep us going, keep us focused on task, and make it a cohesive unit if we can build those. How do we do that? A business organization, right? We've got the mutual upside in that if we're all equity sharers, we share. We've got mutual downside if we've got fiduciary duties to each other. Indeed, fiduciary duties are a little I think, underappreciated as being a piece of this. That you're not allowed to compete. You're not allowed to go out and do other things. We've got our upside in this basket. We've got our downside in this basket. We're there together. We will work together in ways that bridge that defection. So, institutions like the law can be a solution space for these incentive and support differences. How they're deployed into the business end of this context is perhaps a little different from how we would deploy them into the academic context, and we need to kind of keep those straight. One place this is intellectual property. Intellectual property. Very interesting conundrum, because we see that the kind of protection that gives you security down here gets a little difficult when you're up there in the science part, right? Where do we do that? How do we do that? I think that we're in a circumstance where we probably need some intellectual property reform. I think we've got to figure out the patent law a little differently. I think we've got to make disclosure a little looser. We've got to loosen that up a little bit to make it so that we can maintain better both ends of this spectrum, so that we have people publishing, but we also have people with the ability to get some benefit from the fruition of their thinking as well. That said, here I am. I've given it all away. It's great, isn't it? Maybe it's not worth anything. Maybe it's not patentable, but there we go. Fine. Because we're in an academic context. Okay. Thoughts and questions so far? Other thoughts and questions? I'm my professor. I've got you all quieted down. All right. Okay. Now, handoffs. Let's think about handoffs for a minute, because I think they are critical in this context. Handoffs are critical. Why would the handoff be critical? Because very rarely, I think, do we see individuals with skills across all of these things. I'll get to the M.E.M program in a moment. We're creating, super people, right? But very rarely do we see people with all of these talents. And frequently, what we're seeing is handoffs going back and forth across these domains, right? And even the M.E.Ms often, this is the venture capital process is folks saying, we need to help you find down here, right? Because you're up in, like you guys know how to do up here. Very rarely do we find that combination all the way across. And also very rarely do we find the combination of elements. It's not just individual talents, but the ability to self-finance. Now, we'll get to that a little bit when we get down to some of these opportunities, right? But, and particularly in tech, the capital requirements are just plunging all the time. But in things like medical devices and all that, you're still very capital intensive. How do I? So it's not just I need to access elements which are going to require handoffs along the way. Are going to require bringing new folks in on the team as we go along. So first of all is how do we promote handoffs? Because if I'm right in this, that part of what it makes innovation faster would be to accelerate the ability to transfer from one modality to the next. How do we do that? Universities are notoriously bad. Dartmouth is, I think, better than many at tech transfer. And part of the problem is that they haven't really, as an institution, figured out, I think, how to promote that handoff appropriately from the folks way out there who just want to get up in the morning and have someone hand them breakfast and then go in the lab and keep thinking about that problem that they only barely manage to sleep away from overnight. And yeah, but I remember one academic, although it was not a science academic, but it could have been in that I took a class from, whose socks never matched. And that was, I think, emblematic of, academia. Who cares? Who cares? And at one level, they're correct. Who cares? But it also was this, emblematic to me of a complete detachment from the normal stuff. Feed me breakfast, give me a place to house. I think in some ways of Newton, right? Isaac Newton. If you go to Cambridge University and look, he was at Trinity College in Cambridge, and his rooms were there. Now, we're going to dispute me on this because he was more worldly than I'm doing. But somebody fed him
He was an awful person in terms of everything you could ever read about him.
Okay, so he's an awful person, but he was also taken care of always. You know, I mean, he was, being a fellow at Cambridge College is like being, at a camp all the time, where you're kind of, a camper. People feed you, and they, you occasionally talk to a student, and then you just, wander around thinking, bumping into walls, and for that kind of thing, it's spectacular. But how do you tease out from that person the stuff further down the list here? How do you tease out from that person? How do you make them care? Well, one of the things you do is you get them into talking to the folks at the engineering school. Because again, I think without too shamelessly pandering my audience here, right? You are able to deal up there in that kind of stuff, but you're also able to envision it down the ladder a bit, or up the ladder, or wherever it is. How we're viewing this process. So the raw discovery piece needs to be then promoted to meet the others. And then that needs to meet these other folks. And indeed we have, I think, reasonably developed techniques for doing that. There's this Dartmouth Entrepreneurial Network, what's it called?
That's exactly
That's what it's called.
That's very creative.
There we go. Part of whose purpose is to facilitate some of these handoffs. At least I presume that's a part of the purpose. We've got co-programs here with the Tuck School, right? Where we've got the innovation programs. Part of that is so that folks who are across that will meet each other at this level, work a bit, and come to understand what working and handing off looks like. But at least to me, I think that if we understood and made explicit the handoff process a little more explicitly, that would be a useful thing for us to do. And would be perhaps an opportunity, really, if you think about this in isolation. How do I promote that handoff? Because in each of these things, there's often an arbitrage opportunity, right? We know that if folks are good at stuff that other people aren't, they can take a little bit of the toll for themselves. Which leads me to my next point, though, is that we have to keep the handoffs fair. That doesn't mean they have to be equal, but they do have to be perceived as fair, or people will avoid them. I've done some work on at least ways of modeling fairness. There's some interesting stuff out there in the biological literature about this, and also in the game theoretic literature. David Parks, for instance, talks about things have to be at least situationally rational. You have to hand off as you do, you don't have to get all the value, but if the next round takes all the value from you, you feel like a chump. Why did I do that? Even if I'm being fed and treated like a camper, at all times. I just feel like a chump, and I don't like to feel like a chump, so I'm not going to go talk to those people if I'm afraid they're going to turn me into a chump. So the handoffs have to be both informationally effective, in terms of getting what needs to happen to the next group of folks who need to make it happen, but it also has to be kept fair to keep people in the game. Now, that's a problem because there is a sequential property to these games that frequently involve the fact that the last entrant gets to appropriate more than their share, in effect. If you've got 4 necessary elements, the first necessary element puts it on the table. Now they're at a complete risk for expropriation from the next necessary element. Just a game property, that each successive necessary element can extract, in a sense, more. It's a reverse irrigation game. There's what's called the irrigation game, where you put things on the table and the first person gets to take most of it out and all this. But this is essentially reverse. That each gatekeeper, each successive gatekeeper gets to control pretty much what went before. How do we get around that? How do we get around it? Well, one of the things is that we can structurally build some of that around by things like intellectual property. We give the intellectual property, this is that same problem again, back to we give the intellectual property up here, the folks here have got to at least do a deal. But as we know from venture finance and that kind of thing, the first deal is not the last deal, right? Each successive round, unless you can lock people in a way, becomes an opportunity for expropriation along the way. I think one of the reasons why venture capitalists sometimes get a bum rap is that at least some of them are not immune to exploiting the power that successive step gives you. When is it that you can counteract? There are mechanisms you can use to counteract that. One of them is open market, a market of some kind. In other words, if you could have competitors, then the competing gates, then the power of the gates lessens considerably, right? So a continuous market in shares is something that would perhaps redistribute power up and down and that kind of thing. So a continuous market in early stage finance. And indeed, we're working on, and other folks are also working on models for permitting a more market-based early stage finance, which should have the benefit of evening out some of that gatekeeper power and keeping things fair. There could also be things like if you look at the movie industry, which I did some work in at various points. The movie industry, there are unions of writers, which mean that writers get a minimum. Again, there are ways of building things back up into this as well. And indeed, Dartmouth does some of that, and other places with tech transfer do some of that, because one of the things they do is they say, if you're going to deal with our faculty, here's minimum terms. And those minimum terms need to be kept in account.
Can you talk a little bit about the history? And I don't know exactly, I haven't talked with Steve a bit about just different schools and their attitude towards commercialization of tech and some of those deals. And so what I do know is there was a big East Coast, West Coast difference where Stanford was very aggressive about letting professors have ownership in new companies, and Harvard and MIT weren't for a long time. And just what are new models that are emerging that help facilitate that, or to your point, help protect?
A little bit. I can talk a little bit. Again, that handoff. One of the things is that if you let, one of the reasons that Harvard or MIT is resistant is they're trying to protect their institutional psychology around the sharing model, and their concern is that if we turn our professors into this, have we lost them as being professors? So there's this kind of, one of the things that's interesting is that each of these areas has a psychology of its own worth, and it armors its psychology by saying, oh, those other folks doing that stuff are nasty and commercial, or have their head in the clouds and wouldn't know it, a good idea if it bit them. I mean, it's a little bit like being in the Marines. If you're going to be in the Marines, you say the few, the proud. The esprit, the way in which cultural groups maintain their ethos requires typically being resistant to other ethoses. And so at least a piece of this, yeah.
I was going to say, on your hands-off. It seems to me you've left off the critical element on that, which is that if I go from being the discovery guy on the science side, as you described it, with glory coming from the length of the resume, then isn't the student the key to the handoff?
Good point. What a good point. Okay, I'll have to work the student in on this, because it is often the student and or the postdoc. The younger folks are often. You and I are. There we go. Exactly. We're at the wrong end of this curve, or the right end of the curve, depending upon our viewpoints. But good point that there is even within up here there's nuance that I need to build into the model.
Because I think if you look at the spin-off model, what I'll call the spin-off model for the moment, which is a lot of the Route 128 specialty, if you will, that most of that, when you kind of peel it, the real genius is still sitting at the Harvards, the MITs, the Dartmouths, and so on. But the guys who made it, quotation marks, or created the entities, were their students who said, I don't need a long resume anymore. I know how to take it down to steps 2 or 3 or 4. Probably not 4, but 2 or 3 in that first paradigm.
There we go.
And it becomes an interesting question as to where that transfer, as you've got. I think the hands-off's the right question, but it's an interesting question as to exactly to whom am I handing it, because there is a trust question. Who do I talk to?
Yeah. No, and the trust problem is part of what I'm talking about here. The trust problem is solving the trust problem in this is huge. That's a big piece of it. Because you're in a sense putting yourself, if you don't have a market where you can rely on that to give you fair value, when you hand it down to the next piece in the chain, you're looking for someone who's going to treat you right. One idea that I've had, and again skipping down a little bit further here, is providing, would it make sense to have in a sense preferred entrepreneurial groups that universities align themselves with under set deals. Now there are downsides to this one as well. But if you've got repeat interaction is one of the guarantors of better fairness. You've got a signed up, a preset deal, which will give you some of that. There's a series of things that might occur within that context. Now you're limiting yourself. You're arguably giving unfair preference to some folks. There are some problems involved with that. But as you say, students are often filling that gap. That's an excellent insight. But how else we could structure it so that other folks could come in there on a kind of a trusted basis is another piece. Yeah.
Yeah. I had one more thing, which I think you said you're positing some of this for the first time,
right?
Your model, and I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the contribution of the economic activity back to at least engineering, if not discovery.
Good point.
And so, a simple example: there was a company formed in the Boston area by a professor at Harvard in neurological diseases called autoimmune. Didn't ultimately succeed in a product, but it developed 87 patents around an innovation called oral tolerance. And it became the foundation of worldwide conferences in oral tolerance that attracted professors, researchers, and the like, from academia as well as from big farms.
Okay.
The $120 million that went into autoimmune, in a sense, fed back on academic discovery. Glycopide, out of here, never actually had a product when it was purchased. And when it was purchased, Merck set it up as a ninth worldwide research center. So it didn't come down through and stop at commercialization. What happened was, in both cases, commercialization attracted a lot of money that went back into the top in feeding more scientific and invention effort.
Which is another great point of the inputs going back and forth across.
Right, but the corollary is that the commercialization of academic discoveries does not result in income of the type that we think is reflected in cars or houses. It also creates income in further research.
Okay. Yeah. And commissioned research, I mean, directly and also indirectly, as you say, just by being providing a resource, presuming that there is sufficient openness and non-closedness around that. I mean, the process you're describing was terrific in that they kept the process at least partially open around, maybe they got their patents early enough and that's great. But keeping that process partially open is also useful. I will take 1 second just to remind people that open source can be a great way to make money. Lawyers are an open source information exploitation system. That our underlying knowledge base, the law, is open source. We do not claim copyright in things typically. We do not claim, the U.S. government explicitly pronounces copyright, legal opinions, all that kind of stuff. Contract forms, people by and large, they're starting to now, there's some copyright trolls out there trying to stop people from using others' forms. Basically, what we sell is expertise around an open source system. And we do just fine. Now, that's not...
As long as there are two of you in the same.
There we go, exactly. You know, and three's even better, you know. I'm in that business. I'm inventing new ones every day. But my point being that there are ways in which certain ecosystems rather can work on open source spaces. I'm not saying it's a panacea. There are plenty where the closedness is what you need, but I'm just pointing out that a system of strictly held IP does not necessarily help folks improve their ways to make money. IBM shifted over to a mixed strategy a few years back, right, on terms of putting a lot of their stuff into the public domain. Not a full dump, but and they've done just fine as a result. So openness can work there too. But again, this well taken. I will try and put that into the model of that. All right. So the handoff But play, keeping it fair, university challenge. How do we do this within? How do we do this within the university? Within the thing we're talking about? How do we better create cross-silo kinds of interactions? I mean, again, a model that could work is that to require all faculty to actually have a weekend retreat with folks outside their departments. I mean, that would be a possible model, right? Where you said, look, it's time for the folks in physics and the folks at there and the folks at to talk to each other. We're just going to put 7 of you in a room. You're going to talk to each other all weekend. Is something going to happen? I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, that's a relatively sort of random way of trying to do it. But anyway, there's challenges there. The legal challenge. Again, a lot of these things, these handoff problems that I've talked about, are ones that have institutional tools in law that we talk about. And indeed, if you're going to hand off to a VC, right, if you guys are going to go and take your idea and go to a VC or whatever, you're effectively using the law as your handoff mediator. Or if we have the invention stuff up here and IP, we're using the law as the handoff mediator, as the kind of the protector of that tricky handoff transaction between different actors. So anyway, that's a spot in which the law exists, and it's part of what engineering management 188 right attempts to teach us is how to protect ourselves and use those appropriately. Education. Another possible bridge across some of this is education. And indeed that is at least, I think a piece of this is what the M.E.M program is seeking to accomplish, is to find, again, those super people who are going to be able to work their way across at least a wider range of this kind of continuum than not. So courses in business, courses in the raw, everything from the raw discovery, project management, all of this kind of stuff is effectively an attempt in a year and a half to train people across that a large portion of that. Is that a fair representation of recent students? I mean, a way of thinking about it. Not the best. No, you'll get me with it. So we've got this possibility that education can help bridge this gap. By the way, education, it shouldn't just be M.E.M. One of the things that has occurred to me thinking about this is that we need the equivalent of the M.E.M. for lawyers. That there ought to be a master's in how to represent technological clients that tells you some of the stuff about technology, some of the stuff about the different phases, some of the stuff about, there's a whole set of things about project management. Do you realize that project management, which seems just the world's most straightforward thing, is taught almost nowhere in law schools? And what is a case or a project? But a case is a project to manage. And folks are left completely at sea about what that may look like. So anyway, there's big opportunities there in education. So we can do this. Another piece of education is education across the different cultures. In the international context, we're getting reasonably used to the notion that there's cross-cultural knowledge you have to have. If you're going to go do a contract in Japan, there's a set of expectations that would be different than they would be in New York. When I was a practicing lawyer, there were famous stories about that, and I even stepped on one of them myself. I went and talked to the wrong person on the wrong level of hierarchy, and one went on kind of there we go. Anyway, they're just our cross-cultural expectations. One of the things I think we need to remember is that within the innovative entrepreneurial chain, going both directions, are cross-cultural pieces. And if you come in and want to talk to your science folks the way you would talk to the finance folks, it's not going to work, right? You're going to need to be both basically capable, but another piece of education is in that sort of cross-cultural piece. Okay. Final thing on this is research and development opportunities. Does following a paradigm something like this provide us with research and development opportunities? Certainly at the academic level, I hope so. That's where I tend to live, is at the academic level. And it's been good to me, what can I say? I've been able to work with some very capable folks around questions like this mechanism design question, or institutional design. That's been a big piece of the grant that I've been working on down at Harvard, is a set of how would you instantiate these institution and mechanism principles into a digital milieu. Because the Lessig insight that code is code, you know, that if your technology provides the rules, they can actually be pretty self-enforcing in effect if your technology is robust and is not subject to rule hacking. I can't buy a book from Amazon without giving them a credit card. Now, there are ways I can hack that and try to, but basically I've got to give them a credit card. A credit card this is a technological anti-shoplifting effect, right? That is very hard to shoplift in Amazon. Okay, keeps you honest, keeps you honest. There are the equivalents that you can build into other kinds of transactions. I'm working on currently on a project to construct a software that will be a self-executing, I shouldn't say self-executing, an available platform for setting up a simple LLC. And we've got the software written, and we'll be launching it hopefully in the next few months. I've been saying that for several months now. In around Vermont. Vermont passed a set of laws on this. Recently, Nevada got in touch with me, and they're looking at passing a set of laws that will permit, and then the Secretary of State will implement a complete entrepreneurial platform that will include, if you incorporate in Nevada, as opposed to Delaware, a suite of software tools that will allow you to run your company. All of the agreements, bylaws, minute keeping, all of that will be available on the Secretary of State's website for if you're a Nevada company, and you get to run your company essentially for free in all those legal technicalities right into their website. And that will, I think, be a terrific opportunity in lots of ways, and is a vision beyond where I've been able to help Vermont get to. So there we go. Nevada's the so anyway, there's a set of these mechanism design questions, at least to me, that are very interesting. How do we institutionally do that? How would we solve some of these handoffs in a better way? How would we find these online finance handoffs, the incubator spaces, the Y Combinator, places where we're seeing that. We've been working with the SEC around rule changes in their rules about private offerings and that kind of thing to try and create spaces within which small-scale investment can take place in a more market-based format. Why? Because that frees up some of these arbitrage, a gatekeeper, toll and rent taking, and if we can open that up a bit, we can perhaps have a better ecosystem there. Again, there's opportunities there. Yeah.
So you're obviously, a lot of this is really exciting. How open do you think the legal community is to a lot of this? Because I think I've got plenty of ideas in terms of how to fix that. And buildings is around exactly what you're talking about. Are you unique, or are there other people like you that are like, okay, we need to fix that?
Unique would be strong, but I do like to think I'm out near the front edge of this stuff. We should talk. Berkman at Harvard is doing this. The Law Lab project is creating some of this. Okay. At Vermont Law School, I'm hoping that we will institute, find some wood to touch, institute a digital law institute, a piece of which is going to be application building centers. We haven't had that discussion yet. I will flag that to you. That partnerships with engineering schools and technical places to think in terms of legal app creation, because it's just sitting out there. Just sitting out there ready to go. And again, there we go. Take it if you like. I mean, what would be with legal apps? There are places like Westlaw and LexisNexis, the developed companies, which are doing a lovely job at this. I'm in touch with them. They're great folk. But there is also places where there would be room for entrepreneurial efforts into a bunch of these things. So, mechanism design, and indeed the last thing on my list here is something I'm thinking about at the moment. Does the cloud become the incubator space? Do we need a valley? Do we need a fen? Do we need a 128? Do we need any of those things? If the cloud is there, can we build most of what folks need, at least in the tech end? Again, bio and some of the other things, a different ecosystem. But at least on the tech end, is the cloud become our incubator space? where computing is so cheap we just give it away, or nearly give it away, where we trade, where we have, it used to be that, we have incubator spaces, right down here towards the hospital, are physical places where folks come and they set up their IKEA tables and all that kind of thing. Do we need that in a cloud context? Are there things we can do out there? And again, this is part of that notion of the LLC software or the Nevada portal, if that goes forward. Are there places where we can roll a bunch of those attributes together and help? And which also, if they've been well designed, lead you through some of these steps in a way. Part of what a well-designed platform does is it means that you don't have to reinvent how things interact. Yes, you may want to be able to change your default rules, but a good set of default rules in a platform speed you right through it, right? So anyway, that's a possibility, yeah.
I think across those stages that an element that's missing is just the source and interaction between all the people that are doing those things and the people that provide the capital.
Okay, good point. Because at least I to some degree presume that in here. But yes, as a sidebar is always money, and it would be useful perhaps to make that more explicit. Okay. Yeah.
Two thoughts. So one is the model, and it's relatively simple, so it works. I mean, models you can make them very complicated. You can keep adding elements to it; it gets more and more complicated, and then you can't even.
And it doesn't help you anymore, right?
It doesn't help anymore. So in its simplicity, it works, but instead of thinking of it in a linear fashion, it's almost there. It's circular with the same elements, because there's a lot of cross interaction. The interaction is not necessarily linear. There's a lot of to and fro that goes on. So if you think about it as a circle instead of a line,
right,
then you've got a lot of interaction.
And you can draw things.
You can actually draw things a lot easier. Right? The other thing is if you're thinking of multiple entities, you could actually study this in a given entity itself. If you studied IBM, right? IBM does all those things. From the Watson Center doing core research, what you call science, what they would call research, what you call engineering, they would call development. Right? So if you studied IBM or Microsoft or any of these tech companies, they actually do all those things, including fighting for the money. Right? When I've got an idea, I want to promote it, I've got to fight for the money from somebody else. They actually go through the whole thing.
No, good point. Because one of the things that you can do is create a kind of a firm membrane. Or within the membrane of a firm, I think of firms in this sort of membrane metaphor. That we wrapped in this membrane of legal interaction and propertized interaction is something like IBM and these kinds of things. The difficulty and you're absolutely right, but at least the piece of the difficulty is, if I take your circle metaphor, is that the RD, which is the raw discovery as well as research and development side, gets harder. Given at least I think that's harder with that interactive piece, that they tend to be more interactive within themselves than out into the outer world. Now there's I know there's some differences in that, and some companies turn their folks loose more, but there's still that kind of lingering don't give it away ethos that's going. The most famous counterexample to this that I'm aware of is the old one that Xerox had, right, that Steve Jobs wandered through. That was truly, they were just giving it away. And Steve Jobs took it. Okay? And the graphical interface, he didn't invent the graphical interface, Xerox did, right? They were behaving like a university. And there. But your point is well taken, which is that A, the circle is probably the better thing to do. And secondly, that yes, my using the university as the paradigm up here is perhaps wrong, and using the independent entrepreneur model the whole way down is perhaps wrong. There are special challenges to firms doing all of this, and there seems to be a life cycle piece of it. I mean, there's that classic challenge of how you take a mature firm like Microsoft and keep it innovating. I mean, Google is already, they're only a few years old, right? They're already bouncing off that and trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we keep this piece going while we're down here? We're so successful down here. And again, it's interesting to see how they do it, and some are doing it more successfully than others.
I'm intrigued by your overall framework, but the handoffs and the idea that sort of you've got very open information flow with one hand and very closed information flow with the other hand. I'm curious how much you've thought about the vertical movement. And I'm sitting here thinking that an awful lot of of the things that are really interesting in the business community are how much information do I share along a vertical? You know, at the extreme end, you have the bond market where one person in the room is a sucker.
Yeah.
At the more idealistic end, you have, you know, at least the theory behind every good merger and joint venture and antitrust issues and what have you of how open do we get there. And it strikes me as a whole interesting continuum of issues around recognizing that there's value in information sharing with my potential competitor, but how do I do that in a way that's effective? Because basically, I want to have leverage up and down this vertical, and I can't get that without getting comfortable with it.
Part of it is what we model as a public goods problem. At least I've been viewing it in somewhat in that way. I've been viewing it in and around cloud interoperability standard setting, because this is a version of what you're talking about in any way, which is the whole problem of creating interoperability is one that benefits the entire structure, as it were, and can grow the sector. But one of the strategies, the limiting strategies, is to have your own standard, and then you know, this is the Facebook approach, right? It's, you know, we prevent you from scraping. We're going to lock you in. You can't easily extract your data from Facebook. By the way, there's a huge business opportunity if you get out there for a cooperative Facebook with total data portability. I think that actually, if you could get a reasonable amount of adherence early on, could go and eat Facebook's lunch. But that's a different thing. But your point is well taken. Where do you share? Where don't you share? How do I protect? Because it's often easier for the mature businesses to be more generous across that. Why? Like IBM with its open source stuff, is because you're now depending upon market position and capital strength to defend yourself, rather than from some kind of little chunk of proprietary knowledge to defend yourself. So perversely, it's easier for IBM to be resistant to patents than it is for a new inventor, because the new inventor is the person who's trying to actually use the little piece of secrecy to get into the game. The folks already in the game, the incentives are a little easier for sharing. One thing is, it's a role also for government. Government can be the wrong player in portions of this story. It can be the right player in other portions of the story. And one place where it's the right player, I think, is in the standard setting and information sharing kind of role. They can have, you know, convene forums. There's a convening power that goes forward. Actually, as a piece that universities can play as well. We find that we, down at the Berkman project I do, are a place where folks who need to talk to each other about sharing of information across different companies can come together and do that in a way that they couldn't in other contexts. So again, the convening power of the university can be there. But it's a good point.
It might be interesting when you come to the big companies, not think it's just about entrepreneurs within the big company, but the big company in the context of so-called parent. And so if you look at Beaverton, Oregon, there's a couple hundred spin-offs of one tech company, small town, lots of entrepreneurs. If you look at Minneapolis, just to create some places like Beaverton and Minneapolis where it's a relatively discrete area, so it just doesn't go on and lose the discipline. Take Medtronic of St. Jude, and you can find 1,000 or more spin-offs of two major companies. So they're doing their own innovation.
Right.
Okay, but they also represent the source of derivative innovations. And that certainly happened in Boston years ago. DEC and Data General and virtually every electronic-based hardware and then ultimately software company. So when you build your model, like I think there's Bertram, the guy that looks at academic citations.
Yeah.
And there people build similar models in IP, where it shows where every patent came from and how it's linked to every other patent. And I think that in the big company, small company, there's a system there where people are learning from one another and bridging. And it's all actually off of often the same scientific innovation, but multiple engineering groups.
And that ties in actually to the point on professors and students as well. That, you know, that there are these kinds of seed plants, as it were, which can be both academic and commercial as places from which things hive off and get going. And that's a good point. In that, by the way, there is a set of institutional legal things. It's been argued that one of the reasons that California has been so successful is the failure or the limitations on the enforcement of non-competes. Okay. And that California law is particularly unfavorable to enforcing non-competes once you leave up front. Their notion has been everybody needs to be able to have a job and just get, you know, it's a matter of public policy. You can agree up front not to do it, but guess what? You're going to be allowed to because that's what we let happen. And note that would be one of the things that would be hard for any individual company to agree to. If the individual companies could do this, there's a dynamic to say protect, protect, protect. The dynamic is hard to resist. But you get together as a society and say, guess what? The rules, we're just going to change the rules for everybody, and the rules that you can poach each other, or go out and start your own. You know, exactly some of the kind of processes you're talking about may be more fostered or not. So again, there's an institutional basis to some of these effects in how we design our legal contractual rules. Overprotection. Too much, underprotection. It's an interesting. You got to find sweet spots for this, and they're not always. You know, taking care of one problem may not always do another. A lot of these are what I sometimes call Goldilocks problems, right? Where you know you got multiple factors, and it's got to be just right, rather than too hot or too cold. Yeah?
I mean, have you thought about the entry points into this model? You know, from one end you talk about broad discovery, academia. On the other end, you can say that there's a need, and then we find a solution. In the medical device world, which I live in, you have surgeons often working in academia as well, and then you have this weird incentivization world where you have a lot of surgeons practicing preventative or defensive medicine, or not reporting complications in scholarly articles, and it's like an inefficiency in the system because it slows down opportunities for innovation and identifying problems and going through the system and finding solutions to make things better. Right, yeah.
right. No, you're absolutely right, and come back to, you know, the fact that we, you know, our incentive space matters. Yeah. And at least one possible take off the top of my head on what you're talking about is that, again, the tort system may be causing some of the problem in this, right? We've got a set of legal rules that are not related to intellectual property, which are nonetheless suppressing disclosure. For instance, I'm just vaguely aware of the stuff around what was that pain relief drug that was widely used in arthritis that turned out to, you know, increase the chances of what am I thinking of? Vioxx. There we go. Vioxx. It was the only thing that ever cured my recurring back problems with Vioxx. So, you know, I keel over. You'll know why. We've got tort structures and things like that. It'd be great to have a kind of a tort exception for folks who get right out there early and say, you know, if you come clean really early with a problem, you can then box your damages from the time of disclosure. I mean, that would be a useful piece for curing some of that incentive problem. Whether we get there or not is another matter. That might be a piece of it. Again, if we're truly trying to do innovation,
What chances do we have actually in this country for reform, which is like the worst in the world? Like, do we have any chance of fixing that?
Let me put. I've avoided lawyer jokes so far and lawyer stereotypes so far. Let me sound like a lawyer joke for a moment. And before I comment on the yes, there's a problem. Let me also comment on the yes, there's a solution. The tort system, particularly in things like med and all that kind of med malpractice, we have privatized our regulatory structure with huge success. You know, that in effect, rather than having a self-regulatory set of bodies around these things, where we've decided that didn't really succeed very well, or having a government regulatory structure, we've instead said, well, privatize. And normally when privatization works, we applaud. So we have privatized a lot of product safety and consumer safety into private actors, and it works to a large degree. Not perfectly, but we have, I think, a relatively high safety level in this. Now, the question is it efficient? Is it good? Is it too much? All that sort of thing. Having done my commercial for it, now I'll tackle the fact: is it too much? And the answer is yes. Of course, it's too much. Like any good thing gone astray. There we are. Reform. It is reformable if it stops being used as a political tool and becomes a solutions-based question. In other words, there are issues in the United States of America that we use to polarize and then beat each other with. And we never solve those. Why? Because we don't want to. This is political dynamic. We want to beat each other with them rather than solve them. It's useful for the left to say, oh, those harm. It's useful for the right to go, oh, My wife is a legislator in Vermont, and so I get a little bit of a perspective on this and a little bit of a perhaps unfair partisanship on some of this. The session that just ended in Vermont was very calm. One of the reasons is that both sides worked hard with each other to find solution spaces. And the budgets were tough. They passed without dissent practically. Where did that come from? Well, because they've done the work. They decided. Now, it also was an election. It was not an election year. Next year, they'll polarize so they can have an election. A lot of this stuff, the solution space to our deficits, everybody knows what we got to do, right? We got to raise some taxes, we got to cut some spending, we got to figure it out. And the Republicans say everything's on the table except raising taxes. Why? Because they want to beat the other side with it. Solutions won't come. So, tort reform, at least at the moment, is one of those. If we move it from that to a solution space, we'll figure it out. We'll make it work. But that's a hopeful way. Okay. All right. Many thanks. I look forward to chatting with some of you individually. I appreciate greatly the chance for this. I've learned a lot. I hope I've sparked some ideas. Thanks very much.